and the Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. It's a privilege to welcome you all to today's discussion, Choices and Challenges, Learning from Parents' Experiences with School Choice for Students with Disabilities. This discussion is part of a wonderful program here at BU Wheelock, the Equity and Social Justice webinar series. We invite you to check out our website for some upcoming events. I'm Marissa Claw. I'm the Managing Director for the CERES Institute for Children and Youth. We are dedicated to community-engaged research and evaluation that centers the voices and experiences of youth, families, and communities. Working with key partners and communities, we use rigorous, systematic, and innovative methodologies to develop knowledge that policymakers and practitioners can use to support children, youth, families, and the communities that they're in. Today's conversation focuses on school choice and centers the experiences of families in Florida, utilizing 2 scholarships for students with disabilities. Our discussion is timely, as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis recently signed a law making a historic expansion of school choice in the Sunshine State, which is effective July 1st. I'm gonna talk you through today's agenda. Today's agenda will feature a brief presentation of our recent study, Choices and Challenges. Following the research presentation, there will be a moderated panel discussion, and our event will conclude with questions and answers from you, our audience. If you have questions for our panelists or presenters, we invite you to use the Q&A icon that should be at the bottom of your Zoom window. If we don't get to your question, you can feel free to email us at ceres@bu.edu, that's CERES@bu.edu, and we'll be happy to follow up. I'll also put that information into the chat. Closed captioning is available for this webinar. Please use the CC icon at the bottom of your screen to turn your captions on or off. And a link to the recording will be emailed out following this webinar. Without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Shannon Varga. Shannon is our Associate Director for Research and Evaluation at the CERES Institute and a Research Assistant Professor here at BU Wheelock College. Shannon is also the lead author for the Choices and Challenges report, and we're so pleased to have her join us today. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in during this very busy time of year. I am very excited to share the findings from this momentous research project that my team and many of our partners undertook in Florida. I'm going to quickly share a very brief high-level overview of the findings. I'm trying to reserve as much time as possible for discussion and questions with our expert panelists, but I'm happy to talk about anything I present further after this presentation or outside of this webinar with anyone who's interested. So why Florida? For students with disabilities in particular, Florida has been a leader in providing statewide school choice scholarship options in this country. And many states are watching, as the recent legislation Marissa mentioned will result in merging the 2 programs that we examined in this study. Previous evaluations of the McKay program or others like it haven't really delved into a deep understanding of parents' experiences with these scholarships. And so given their popularity and the funding for it, it's important to gain this understanding about this experience from the perspective of those who actually have to use the scholarship. And so that's what our study is really focused on. Building on previous research, we conducted a large-scale mixed method study of parents' experiences with the Gardner and McKay scholarship programs. So qualitatively, this meant that we conducted individual and group interviews across Florida with 91 parents who had utilized either the Gardner or McKay scholarship. We asked parents about their experiences before their scholarship, getting the scholarship, using the scholarship, and any feedback that they had for the scholarship. And quantitatively, our colleagues from the University of Arkansas, Dr. Albert Chang and his student Emily Cody, deployed a statewide survey that eligible participating and non-participating parents completed. The survey, which builds on a 2003 study, asked parents about their satisfaction with their child's previous school and their current school, which they attend with the scholarship. These are the research questions that guided our data collection and analyses, and they basically cover parents' navigational and satisfaction experiences with the programs. We also asked them for feedback that they had. These are the demographics of parents who filled out the survey. They are separated by which survey they had used or if they were eligible for either survey but never utilized either. And so here you can see the racial demographics. They reported their income and their education level. Importantly, this is not the demographics of all parents who use the scholarships in the state. These are just the demographics of parents who responded to our study, the survey. And then here are the demographics that parents reported who we interviewed, and they either used the Gardner, McKay, or 16 of them had experience with both scholarships. And below you can just see the counties that they reported living in. So we had great coverage across Florida. Moving right along, after driving all over Florida to collect this data, our team and our partners at the University of Arkansas analyzed the responses and found that parents find the process of navigating school choice for students with disabilities with these scholarships complex, and we'll get into why. Despite any struggle or additional efforts, the majority of survey and interview parents are satisfied with the scholarships. And parents are so satisfied, in fact, that they overwhelmingly want the programs to continue. Okay, and so just to briefly get into a little bit more specifics about question 1, and that's parents' navigations experiences with the scholarships. Between both the survey and interview data, it became clear that parents in our study came across the scholarships when they were seeking more individualized supports for their children, either academically, behaviorally, or socially. And many of these experiences were driven by dissatisfactory experiences with a previous non-scholarship school. And actually, most parents describe the process of applying for both scholarships once they found out about them very straightforward. So that was actually a big question for our city, but then going in, they were all like, no, once I found out about it, I applied for it and I got it. What came up as a struggle was that parents detailed a number of constraints that weigh on them after they get on the scholarship. And so this is just a snapshot that we presented in the report of what parents are holding when they're looking for a new school. And all these factors can compound to make the decision-making process of enrolling in a new school very complicated. And so again, these are just the things that they told us that they're considering. And so here is a quote from a parent who was very grateful for Gardner, but felt the process could very specifically be improved with more informational support and guidance from someone at the beginning because of all those factors that I showed you on the previous slide. So holding all those factors makes the decision extremely complicated. And then on top of that, parents feel like they aren't given much guidance to navigate those factors. And so that's what creates sort of the difficulty. It's so difficult that many parents describe how they felt the lack of standardized information at the beginning of their school choice journey led to significant effort on their behalf. And some even felt that they underwent preventable transitions from schools that were not great fits for their children just due to this lack of information. And so one parent described it like a full-time job to really assess the quality of all the schools and the supports that are available with the scholarships. And so then here are some pathways that parents described, that they went on when they were using the scholarship. So you can see here that there are some that were straightforward, which meant that they heard about a school, got the scholarship, and were able to attend the school without any issue. But most of the sample described their child having to attend multiple schools before landing at their current school, which is usually their most satisfactory school. And a handful of Gardner parents actually chose homeschooling over any other option that their child attended, suggesting that they didn't feel that there was another option that was better. And so all of this information just gives us some indication that there are common bumps in the road that could be smooth for a lot of parents. And so then finally, in the end, over 50% of parents reported paying out of pocket for education expenses above and beyond the scholarship amount. And the amount that they reported is higher for families who reported incomes above $60,000. But in general, the additional costs that they reported may be enough to prevent some eligible families from using the scholarship, as can be seen on our next slide. This is a quote from a parent who did not end up using the scholarship to move schools because the scholarship did not cover the whole cost of the tuition of the school that they were interested in, and they could not afford to enroll their child in that school otherwise. And so while this situation was rare, it definitely still happened. And it made us wonder if there were other parents who didn't participate who had this experience. So that was what we found about parents' experiences using the scholarship. And now we're going to get into our research question about their satisfaction with the scholarships. So despite everything that I just told you, the vast majority of Gardner and McKay participants are satisfied with the school that their child attended with the scholarship between 2019 and 2020. And the satisfaction is broken down into 9 dimensions or different aspects of schooling in the report. So that includes things like the academic expectations at the school, relationships that they had with the staff, communication from the school, their students, their children's teachers, and order and discipline at the school. And this satisfaction holds across education levels for both scholarships, reported education levels for parents, and income levels for Gardner. The satisfaction is a little bit higher for McKay parents who reported income above $60,000, but not much. And over 50% of the interview sample who, again, reported all of these constraints and factors reported feeling that they ultimately found a school that was a great fit for their child with the scholarship. So we did have a lot of happy parents in our sample. And so we were able to delve into a little bit about why parents might be satisfied. And so, in the survey, over 90% of parents reported feeling more empowered and involved in their children's education. And ultimately, they had a greater confidence in decision-making or, around their child's education after they engaged with this scholarship. And in interviews, parents described feeling that their children were undergoing night and day behavioral, social, and academic changes at their current scholarship schools. And so here's a quote from a parent who really describes how these changes can result in a powerful shift in outlook for them about their children's futures once they have the right supports around their child. And so based on all the data we collected, these are some of the considerations that we list in the report for policymakers as they're merging the programs. And there's a lot more about these in the reports, but I'm just going to say, the first recommendation came because parents consistently identified improving informational resources in their feedback. So they're hungry and they're looking for user-friendly resources about the schools and auxiliary supports that can be accessed with the scholarships. And the level of the playing field implication came because the extra time, energy, and finances that many parents describe as process taking could be a barrier to more parents participating or benefiting from the scholarships. And just the final recommendation came because some parents described a wide variation in school quality when they were visiting schools. And so we could not confirm that within the scope of our study, but there needs to be more systems in place for parents to be able to report their experiences. So that can be looked into in greater detail. And so that concludes our very brief research overview. Thank you all so much for listening. I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Jonathan Zapp, who is the director of the CERES Institute for Children and Youth at Boston University, who will be moderating today's panel.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks for the great presentation. I want to also make sure to thank the Walton Family Foundation for their generous support of this work. Without them, we really wouldn't have been able to really go deep into the lives of students and their families about how they are navigating these very challenging choices in their lives. And so to continue that conversation, I'm incredibly excited to have this panel that we have today because they bring a wealth of wisdom and expertise on these particular choices. And so as you see, there are wonderful credentials, but just quickly, Albert Chang from the University of Arkansas, who is a nationally renowned researcher on issues of school choice. Doug Tuthill, who's the president of Step Up for Students, which is one of the primary servicing agencies for the scholarships that we're talking about. Megan Whitaker, who is with the National Center for Learning Disabilities and really leads on their policy work. And of course, you just heard from Shannon Varga from the CERES Institute. So to get the conversation started, I would love to hear from each of you about really what was the biggest standout finding for you. You each are coming to this work from a different perspective. And so, sort of I come with the assumption that you'll also take away from it potentially different key points. And so whether it was an incredibly surprising finding from you or just a very powerful finding, I would love to just get your insights. And Doug, maybe start with you about what you saw.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Shannon, Albert, and your team for fantastic work. We appreciate it. From our perspective at Step Up, the data is very much reinforcing what we've seen over the last 20 years. There's obviously high levels of satisfaction with the scholarship programs, as explained by the dramatic growth that we've had over the years. We've always had big waiting lists, for example, for the Gardner program in the 6 years that we've had that program. McKay has also grown over the years. But we've also, in our dialogue with families, they've always talked about the challenge of making choices and trying to find what's exactly the best fit for their child. Human development is a complex process. and matching your child to the learning environment that's most effective is challenging. And so it's been on our to-do list for years now to address the issues that Shannon and her team have identified, and Albert and his team. And so I think the study is right on, and the data is very reinforcing to what we've seen over the years.
I think that's really helpful insights, Doug, especially to give that insight about really what's going on in Florida and really what seems to be a lot of momentum, clearly legislatively with the new legislation that's been passed, but also just the number of families that have signed up over the years and recently sign up. Maybe Megan, we'll turn over to you to go from, so Doug really talked about it from the perspective of Florida, but really what stuck out to you from a national perspective.
Yeah, what resonated with me is that, of course, for families that had success, they seem to really like the program. That makes sense. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't stay enrolled in it. But it kind of leaves me wondering about those families who are not enrolled because they weren't able to find a fit for their child. What was their experience like? The study had found that to benefit from these programs, some parents called it a full-time job, right? It requires significant time, energy, and additional financial resources. And so I'm kind of left wondering how many parents can do that? And what about middle and low income families who can't invest the time and resources and energy to make this program work for them? And so I think it kind of leaves me with some additional questions about those families who tried to use a voucher, but maybe were turned away by private schools because of their child's needs or because it didn't cover the full cost. So while I'm glad to hear that many parents were happy with that experience, I think the piece that resonated the most with me was the amount of energy that went into those parents, making it into a good experience, so that it really took a lot of time and investment from them.
Right. Yeah. And, I know we'd love to, have sort of delve into that discussion a little bit more as a group. And I sort of really looking forward to that part, because I think it's a really critical piece of this. Before we do that, I do want to, Albert, turn to you. You've been studying issues of school choice for a number of years, including with this population, and was curious where you see this study kind of positioned within the, sort of the rest of the work that you and others have done on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I guess one of the things that maybe wasn't surprising, or maybe I shouldn't have been surprising, because certainly the high levels of satisfaction among parents who use school choice, I mean, that's been just kind of documented across the board. I mean, I guess if you look at the research on private school vouchers and other programs of the sort, people still debate about to what extent they improve test scores and that sort of thing. And there's some mixed evidence there. Maybe the evidence on educational attainment, whether they go to college or not. I mean, that's a little clear, where it seems more positive there, more positive than student achievement. But when it comes to satisfaction, kind of across the board, we just always see this consistent finding of parents who use it. Even when compared to families who don't, even if you use kind of the gold standard randomized control trials, so you kind of net out any kind of demographic or socioeconomic differences, we see this big difference. And so I think this really falls in line and with the prior literature, and it certainly is encouraging, especially for families who have kids with special needs. I mean, we know the challenges, the unique challenges that they face, and for them, maybe test scores is not the first thing they're thinking about. I mean, and so kind of with that satisfaction measure, kind of pick up on some of try to proxy for some of the things they do care about. And you can look at the report for other things like the lower rates of bullying and things of that sort.
I think that's really helpful to sort of understand where this fits. And I think, the issues, some of the things you bring up, and I think, Megan, that you bring up, I know, Doug, these are things that are the exactly things that keep you up at night. And so, I'd love to turn to you and just, thinking about where you see, especially with this expansion now, as you talk, there have been waiting lists, for building over the years. And now with this expansion, most likely we'll see a reduction in waiting, and many more families who are hopefully, in this case, who are able to engage with these programs. And what are the ways that you're seeing step up, sort of getting ready for that increase?
Well, actually, the problem is actually broader than simply school choice. We've actually started to use the term education choice, because the Gardner is what's called an education savings account. which means you can spend the money on things well beyond schools. So a lot of the families are spending occupational therapy, physical therapy. The Gardner program, for example, serves kids with fairly deep end needs, spina bifida, Down syndrome, autism. So they need a whole spectrum of services they need to access. And the educational savings account gives them the flexibility to spend that money on a variety of services. That actually magnifies the challenge that Shannon identified, because now it's not just picking schools. Now it's the entire universe of services that are available for these children. And there are tens of thousands of providers out there that might be appropriate. And so, and by the way, the McKay program is not an ESA, but becomes an ESA in the 22-23 school year. So we will have well over 50,000 children, towards 60,000 kids in 22-23 using education savings accounts. So the challenge for us at Step Up is, how do we give families the support systems they need to navigate this huge universe of choices in order to make the very best choice possible? My personal belief is that ultimately, this is about customization. You know, every child is unique, and every parent will tell you every child is special. You know, anybody who has more than one child knows that they're all unique and they're all different. And so ultimately, we need to get to a point in public education where we're able to give every parent the support they need to be able to customize an education for their particular child. And for us to Step Up, it means, what kind of infrastructure do you need to build in order to support, in essence, an individual education plan for every child? And our goal really is, as a scholarship program, to have an IEP for every child. And that's not just kids who have been labeled as special needs. We have about 150,000 low-income children on scholarship that ultimately also are going to be on ESAs. So I can see us in the near future having 300,000 plus children, hopefully all with IEPs, and parents then spending their monies within the context of their IEP. That ought to provide more structure for families. And as we figure out how to work with them to do that, and the challenge, of course, is going to be going to scale. That's always a challenge in public education. It's kind of why we have the one-size-fits-all history, is because scaling up is really challenging. And when you talk about customization or personalization, that even magnifies the challenge of scale. But ultimately, that's our challenge at Step Up, is how do we scale in such a way that allows individualization and personalization, and do it in a way that gives the families the support they need to make good choices.
No, thank you for that context and for those insights. And just, I think maybe just for our audience is, can you describe what the difference is between ESA and a scholarship? I think for a lot of people, they may seem like they're just two different names for the same function, but they're actually very different in practice.
Yeah, they are. There's a lot of different. I mean, we tend to use voucher as sort of a catch-all. It's like saying everybody in the Middle East is Arab. There's a lot of nuances and differences. An educational savings account is basically a scholarship, but allows you way broader flexibility. Most of the vouchers and scholarship programs in the country are only for tuition and fees for private schools. ESAs, educational savings accounts, are much broader than that. So like I said, you can spend the money on after-school tutoring programs, summer programs, mentoring programs. It may be occupational therapy, physical therapy. The autistic children in our program have enormous needs. The saying is, you've met one autistic child, you've met one autistic child. So they have very unique needs that they have to access. And so that's really the difference. It's the flexibility of spending an ESA is much broader than a voucher or a traditional scholarship.
Thank you. I think there's a good clarity there for people, just so that you sort of feel full appreciation. Also, as you're saying, as McKay becomes in this new legislation, becomes an ESA, that this becomes kind of the core. And Megan, looking at it from, again, the national level, as you're seeing, I know more states are looking at these kind of levers as possibility ways to get resources to families. What are you seeing nationally about how with that momentum, and also where you see both the opportunity, but also, as we're seeing in, the report, there's some pitfalls to look out for as well. What are you seeing?
Yeah, and speaking strictly from a national perspective, I'm certainly not an expert on Florida's programs, and so not all of this may apply to the expansions that are happening there. But across the country, with the many voucher and scholarship programs that exist, there's kind of three things that I like to keep in mind, all related to equity and the rights of students. As this study found, there's always a subset of parents who can't use these programs because they don't cover the full cost of every private school. And research shows that most voucher programs don't cover the full cost of tuition at a large number of schools. And I think that's particularly important for students with disabilities. If the goal is to get your child specialized services that you couldn't otherwise obtain in public schools, you're likely going to seek out a specialized private school that, that focuses on ADHD or LD or provides some other kind of support for students. And those cost a lot more than a typical religious private school, for example. And so the students who we're hoping will benefit from these kinds of programs may not have access to the schools that will actually meet their needs. And then that results in the voucher really becoming a coupon for families who could probably send their kids to these schools anyway. And it leaves the families who were struggling in public schools back in the public schools unable to meet the needs of their child. And the second thing that I think is a trend we're seeing and a concern nationwide is that students and families relinquish their rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and other civil rights laws when they attend private schools. And it's so important that parents understand and make an informed decision about what they're giving up, and that they know the implications that will be there if they choose to enroll their child in a private school using one of these vouchers. Schools participating in these programs don't have to provide equal access to all students. They don't have to abide by federal anti-discrimination laws for the most part. And so they often can and do turn students away on the basis of not just disability, but race, ethnicity, religion, LGBTQ status. And so parents shouldn't have to sift through schools to find one that will serve their child when they do have a guarantee to a public education through our federal education and civil rights laws. And then I think the third piece is that, even if you do find a school to enroll your child in, there's another hurdle you then have to overcome. And that's kind of the accountability of the schools that are receiving these vouchers. Essentially, you waive your rights under IDEA, but there's still no guarantee that the school that you're enrolling your child in is actually going to meet your child's needs. They might say, we have these programs where we can offer these services. You don't get a legally enforceable document from that school that you can then take to mediation or due process if their child's not provided what they need. Our public school system does have accountability measures in place that includes everything from IDEA accountability to statewide assessments to teacher licensure requirements. Those things are not, there's no parallel structure in private schools and in schools that accept these vouchers. We don't know how qualified the teachers are that are serving our students with disabilities. We don't know whether every parent's getting the services that the school promised when they enrolled their child. And we don't know a whole lot about the outcomes of these students in these voucher programs. So we know that they may not be getting bullied as much. Parents may, subjectively respond to a survey and say, I feel happy, I'm satisfied. What are the outcomes for that child? Are they doing better academically? Are they going on to life after high school and finding employment or going on to post-secondary? And so I think those are all big questions to ask as these programs expand and grow across the country.
Thank you for bringing those tensions. I mean, again, there's again, as we're hearing, I think both in this report, but also from the panel, there's great opportunity here potentially, but then also, real issues that need to be addressed, and and how do you best do that in order to make sure that families are informed and able to make those choices. Shannon, I would love to, you were so deep with 91 families across the state that you talked with, about their experiences in Florida, and we'd just love to hear, based on what you're hearing among the other panelists about what really stuck out to you that really fits into this conversation about both the opportunities that families saw, but also some of the, the barriers they may face.
Thank you all so much for your comments so far. I guess what struck me as someone who's sort of a novice to this school choice space, but was really more invited to do this study as a lived experience expert, I was shocked at the strength of both narratives that parents were presenting, that again, how deeply satisfied they were. And again, the dramatic shift that they felt they were seeing in their children, even though we can't confirm that because we don't have any outcome data. But this is what they were perceiving. And perception is so powerful. But then at the same time, again, that these parents, if you look at the demographics of our sample, are largely middle or upper income, or at least higher income than you would imagine would be looking for extra financial support, and also report pretty high levels of education. And I was just struck talking to them and how many of them had education backgrounds, had gone to grad school themselves, and felt the need to bring that up and point out that it was difficult for them to assess the quality of the schools and stuff. So it felt like there was some really low hanging fruit. In my opinion, it was just shocking to me how many parents brought it up and how much they felt it would make such a difference for other eligible families. Like, they were very happy with the scholarships. They want other parents to have this avenue, this option, if their local public school or their local private schools even, who aren't supported by the scholarship, can't support their child's specific accommodations. But yeah, I was just very struck. So to Megan's point, if these parents with this income level and this education level are pointing out that it's shocking how hard it was for them, you can imagine the parents who would report, lower income and lower levels of experience with the education system having even more or the same level of struggle. And those parents weren't the ones who chose to talk to us. And so that, that does raise questions for me, but also our partner at Step Up, who helped us recruit these parents, talking to them and listening to the feedback that they've taken on from parents over the years and how many shifts they've created in their program. I do, and talking to Doug and their data manager, Dr. Stringer, about the changes that they're already making to try to provide this level of informational support for these families does give me some hope, because if these programs are going to exist and if there's going to be this investment in them, there are very clear ways that came out of our study that parents suggested would make the experience better. That, again, to me feel, I don't know, but maybe they're not as straightforward. So Doug, please feel free to correct me.
Yeah, I'll just, sort of, hey, one is for everybody is, I'm obviously the moderator, but, please, jump in, if you have, sort of to build on somebody's argument or to challenge on something, but Doug, I think that is, I would love to get your perspectives on this, on these questions. And again, these are things I know you wrangle with all the time, and that you're passionately working with your staff to support families. And what do you see both? And actually, we have a audience member, Ben, who wrote a question, which actually was going to kind of be the question I was going to ask, which was really around, when you think about the Florida context, and one issue that's brought up is around this question of, how do I know that this is going to be the school that's right for me? And what mechanisms are in place to hold that school accountable for delivering on what they say they're delivering? And, I know that's a national issue. I know there have been historically issues in Florida around that as well. And I know that's something I know that, again, Step Up wants to make sure that they're also being proactive about. So just to know if you have, sort of insights about like what the role that, whether it's policymakers or whether it's places like Step Up or whether it's another mechanism that you think could help in that situation.
Yeah, well, first, I want to raise a couple of issues. We see no evidence of the kind of discrimination that Megan mentioned. I know that's one of the sort of talking points out there. It's actually against the law to discriminate in Florida based on the federal law. There is a lot of accusations of LGBTQ discrimination, but there's never been a single person filing to us or to DOE about that kind of discrimination. Our experience is that the schools are really fanatically dedicated to helping these families. It's really amazing to me to see the kind of dedication. 80% of our schools are faith-based schools, and it's part of their mission. It's part of who they are. It's part of their core values. And so they work really, really hard to serve every child. And so that's really heartening for me. And you see this, the market's expanding. As Florida grows, you see more and more providers coming in. And I think that's also reassuring. The other thing is that people are voting with their feet. I mean, we can say, well, how does this parent know? Do I really trust parents? I'm not sure parents are smart enough, blah, 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 blah. But parents are beating down the doors to get access to these scholarships. And I really think it's about ownership. It's really feeling like I have a greater sense of ownership. I have a greater sense of engagement. And I think it's a fundamental shift in public education. We've had a top-down command and control system for, since the Civil War. And I think human nature being that people would like to have more control over their children's lives and over their lives. And that's the kind of transformation that we're seeing. But like we talked about, human development is complex, and every child is complex, and finding the right match. I mean, when I go to the doctor, how do I know which doctor to choose? How do I know that Albert's a better doctor than Shannon or better than Megan? How do I make that decision? And when Shannon says, you need these 5 tests, Doug, how do I know that I really need those 5 tests? When Shannon comes back and says, here's here are the drugs you need to take, and here are the drugs on top of those drugs on top of, how do I really know that's the case? So we have this problem across our society as people become more empowered and have more control over their lives, then giving them the tools they need to navigate very complex environments is a challenge. But it's a challenge that we know that exists, and we're committed at Step Up to providing the support systems that people need. The last point is this accountability piece. Historically in education, because there's been no choice, we've equated accountability with regulation. And we think the more you regulate, somehow you can get to quality. But my experience is regulation creates a floor, but it doesn't necessarily, you can't regulate your way to quality. And that special needs community particularly understands that, because there's so much litigation, there's so much unhappiness between families and schools because the schools control all the resources. We're changing that dynamic. Now the family controls the resources. So if they're unhappy with the services they're getting from a provider, they can change and they can take the resources with them. If you're in a district school, you don't have that option. So you end up suing, you end up having litigation, you end all these things. And so by giving people power, by giving them more control over the resources, that's a huge power of accountability. And we want to build on that, but the more knowledge people have, the more information we can give them, the better choices they're going to make, and that's going to drive quality on the provider side.
And Albert, I know a lot of these questions are questions that you've also looked into, both, not just in Florida, but in other places too. I don't know if you have any kind of, additional insights about what you're seeing in your work.
Yeah, I mean, this is always an issue. I think everyone's, all for trying to increase access and as Doug said, a lot of the inequity type issues or the unknowns exists, whether it's medicine or education. And the challenge of serving families from traditionally underserved families, that exists everywhere. Whatever kind of school sector you're looking at. I mean, I just released a study with my colleague Paul Peterson at Education Next, and what we did in that. So we studied a New York City private school voucher program from the 90s, and what we wanted to do in that study is try to distinguish effects for students from different levels of poverty. And so we found that, among the very, very, like the bottom, quintile of disadvantage, that the voucher, didn't have any, there wasn't any difference between voucher users and folks that didn't use the voucher. And by the way, this is a random assignment gold standard study too, so you can think of the voucher, any differences in terms of causal effects, just for folks who want that bit of information. But for the moderately disadvantaged, the ones that, they're still considered disadvantaged, but, they had a little bit of social capital, they had some cultural capital, they're able to navigate the system. And, the program actually doubled their college graduation rates. And so, I want to highlight that because I think it underscores the persistent challenge in every sector of serving the most disadvantaged, but also to underscore that actually there's a lot of resilient families out there that another kind of consistent finding in line with what we're seeing is that as families who previously never had to choose a school, never had to go through this process, that over time they begin to learn how to do that. They become acquainted with how to best serve their child's needs. And so, which is consistent also with the survey data we found, right? That, 90% of the families felt that after receiving and participating in the program, that they felt more empowered over their child's education. They felt like they knew how to serve their kids better. They became more involved. And so, again, I mean, obviously there's always these weaknesses in the programs. And as Doug alluded to, there's a lot of work to be done. But a lot of things are happening, formatively in these families that are using it. And as they use it, becoming connected to other people, other schools, other parents, other families. And a lot of times it's in those kinds of social networks where we get the kind of gains we want to see, the closing of certain gaps and inequities, right? That, it's neither simply a kind of a pure market. You just leave the parents alone and they kind of navigate by themselves. Step Up for Students is kind of it's a case in point that it's not just leaving parents alone, although, there might be some parents that are isolated out there and we need to address that. And on the other hand, it's not just purely thinking about a bigger role for the administrative state, right? I mean, there is a place for litigation and regulation and that kind of thing, but we do have to weigh the trade-offs. Do we get private schools that don't want to participate because of that, or is the kind of the greater litigation and kind of legal infrastructure, is that the way to get all parents the kind of services and promised services and education that they need? I'm for trying to find solutions in all sorts of ways, and I think we kind of think broadly and think about both how the legal side and also the kind of human side can partner together better. We'll do better. I mean, we probably won't be perfect, but I think that's part of the challenge we all face.
John, can I make two more quick points? The giving parents the information they need to make choices is a huge challenge, just not in these particular programs. Over half the kids in pre-K through 12 in Florida are in a choice program. I helped start the magnet school movement in Florida. Most of the choices within school districts. I had doctors, lawyers, teachers making horrendous choices. I taught an international baccalaureate program. A lot of kids were sent to that program that shouldn't have been there. And so it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum in terms of education, inside a district, outside of a district. I'm seeing parents consistently make bad choices across the table. And so the question is, across the board, how do we give parents more information to make a choice, if it's a magnet school choice or a charter school choice or buying a house in this zone versus this zone or a private school choice, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. All this choice is going to continue to become more ubiquitous. How do we give families the support they need to make good choices? The other point I wanted to make real quickly is, we have people all the time say the scholarships or vouchers or ESAs aren't enough. Therefore, maybe we shouldn't do it. And we go to legislature to ask more funding. Those are the very same people say, no, you can't give them more funding. So it'd be wonderful if we had bipartisan support across the board, and that people acknowledge that, yeah, if we're really serious about equity, then we really have to make the kind of investments. I mean, we're fighting like crazy in Florida, and we have one of the best legislative environments, but our low-income kids only get about 60 cents on the dollar that the same kids would get in a district school. And again, the people who criticize us by saying the scholarships are too low are the same people saying, don't give them more money. And so, ultimately, this is a challenge that we all need to face as a society, and we need bipartisan support to come together to make sure that every family has the resources they need to put their children in the right learning environments to help them be successful.
If I could just jump in on this conversation, I think this idea of choice is one that just doesn't sit well with me. It makes it seem as though everybody in the system has a choice, and I think the report clearly demonstrated that that's not the case. There are a lot of families that don't get to make the choice of where they send their child free of cost. And so I want to make clear that while this mechanism may work for some families, it's not a long-term scalable solution in its current form, because it is not available to everyone to the same extent. And I think what's getting lost in this conversation is the system-wide implications of these kinds of voucher programs. You're effectively, when you fund a program like this and you say, it's okay to send students with disabilities into these private schools and we'll relieve school districts of their obligations to serve students with disabilities, you're sending a message that it's acceptable that some schools can't meet the needs of students with disabilities. And it eventually will create a kind of a separate or segregated system for students with disabilities. And that goes against the core tenets of special education law. So I think just fundamentally from a systems perspective, that's a really big piece of this conversation that hasn't been brought up yet. We, as a society, based on our education laws, prioritize inclusion and opportunity for students with disabilities. Decades of research shows the major benefits to inclusion of students with disabilities in our public schools alongside their peers. And I mean, I could cite lots of research studies that point that out, not only for students with disabilities, but for their peers and for their teachers. And so I think that there is no reason our public schools can't benefit from this funding to then be able to provide the kind of professional development and learning opportunities and instructional supports that private schools who specialize in LD or autism or ADHD can also provide. And so why are we creating a separate system and funneling public dollars into a system when our public schools should be and are obligated to be serving all students, and we know how to do it, and yet instead we're creating this separate segregated system?
Well, here's the quick answer, Megan. Nobody ever washes a rental car before they return it. You're ignoring human psychology. People like having freedom. People like having more control over how their children are educated. And parents aren't stupid. They're fighting for their children to do what's very best for their children. And I just think it's a mistake to build a system that ignores the value of our human capital. You can't ignore the values and the expertise that parents have about their own children. So you have to build a system that is inclusive of these families in ways that we haven't in the past. And so at maximizing the expertise of families and using the expertise to help them meet the needs of their children, I think is a value added thing that will improve public education as opposed to hurt it. I don't think we're building a parallel system. I think we're improving the existing system by giving families a bigger voice.
Subfamilies.
Although, I mean, just to kind of chime in on this too, and perhaps maybe try to bridge kind of the tension that we're seeing. I mean, if you got to just look outside the U.S. for a bit. I mean, in Canada, Australia, they don't think of public education simply as public schooling. That there's, there's different sectors. I mean, both countries have a rich Catholic sector, a secular private school sector. They have their government operated schools, and for them, it's not really a zero-sum game between this sector or that sector, public school, private school. I mean, here in the U.S., just because I guess of our history, we've had this kind of common school system. We kind of think in these terms. What if we thought about trying to figure out and solve problems of educational inequity, less in terms of a zero-sum game between public or private, but also just think about all education is public because it serves the common good, right? That private schools play a role in doing this, public schools play a role in doing this. I don't necessarily think we have to think of this purely in terms of a zero-sum game, and certainly there's going to be some kind of sorting here and there, but segregation and sorting, that's present in every sector. And so look, I think thinking ahead, perhaps if we thought of public education more broadly instead of just systems or separate sectors, but more broadly as a system, as Doug kind of alluded to, we might make some headway.
Can I ask then a follow-up to this conversation, and sort of reflecting on a couple of the comments that are in our Q&A, and I think maybe gets more specific about some of the issues we're talking about here. So, a couple of the issues that were brought up, I think both methodologically with the report, but also then what we heard in the findings was around, one is there was a finding that, for many families, the scholarship was helpful, but maybe not sufficient funding for whether it was the services they were looking for, whether it was the schooling that they were pursuing. And then, there's the other question around, which was an equity lens around race ethnicity, not, I think, Doug, as you bring up, not necessarily around any discrimination within the school. So, students not being allowed in the school, for instance, based on background, but more around, are we seeing disproportionalities in the ways that families perceive the supports around them? Whether it's based on language proficiency, whether it's based on geography, knowing that there are some areas of Florida that have more schools than others, as an example of that. So just love some reflections on kind of, those tensions that are out there. They're just, realities, and that, would never pretend that they're easily solvable by any stretch of the imagination, and that it's not necessarily even unique to the private side of the school equation either. So I don't want to, suggest that, but just as we're thinking about, issues of equity through this lens, how do you think about one is the issue of disparity in amount, I guess. And then when we think about access, which could be based barriers that are placed because of cultural, geographic, racial backgrounds.
Well, I do think increasing the scholarship amounts is very helpful. If you have more money, you have access to more options. You have, in particular, ESAs allow you to spend money on transportation and other kinds of services that allow you to access more options. As more kids have, as these programs expand, you'll also have more providers coming into the system. I'm currently being bombarded with people around the country saying, I want to come into Florida, I want to start schools. So as families have more control of their funds, you're finding people coming into the system. And I think as more providers come in, there'll be more access for families. So I think it's basically, we have a dysfunctional market, for lack of a better term. And so as families get more purchasing power, and as particularly low-income families have more purchasing power, you're going to find the provider side responding to that. And so I think ultimately, I think that's the way we need to go. I mean, there's massive, as you know, there's massive inequities in the current system. You know, people can't afford to buy houses at $500,000, $600,000. And so there's all kinds of segregation based on property. Magnet schools are, you know, have tremendous inequity effects. Different classes in schools that are available. I mean, for 15 years, I was a teacher union leader in Florida. I was a public school teacher. And part of the reason I'm sitting here is I was blown away by the inequities, you know, and I said, how do I change this? How do I deal with these inequities? And what I'd found out as a teacher union leader is that my parents had no power. Teachers had power because we were unionized and we had enormous amount of power to take care of each other. But I was frustrated because the parents had no power. And so how do I give parents power? I give them control of their spending dollars, and now suddenly they have power. And you're seeing the effects of that. I just did an interview earlier today with a woman talking about the explosion of Black-owned schools in Florida. How phenomenal is that the communities where people feel alienated, starting to have more and more schools that are owned by people who look like them. That wouldn't be possible without families having control over their dollars. And so I think ultimately the way to get the equity issue addressed is to give people who historically have had no power, give them way more power, and they'll use that power to meet their own needs and ultimately their children's needs. And that will, I think, drive us more towards a more equitable situation. At least that's my philosophy.
Yeah, Shannon, you were again, with our colleagues going deep with a lot of these families about these issues, and talked with people from a variety of backgrounds, and so would love your reflections on that question as well. How are families talking about those issues of access and equity?
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm just going to speak from the perspective of our actual sample, which was, predominantly white and somewhat middle or higher income. And so I do think that some of the experiences that Megan was bringing up would probably be experienced by some of the families who didn't participate. There were some partners that we spoke to on the ground who spoke about, families of color, sometimes experiencing not understanding the idea rights that they're sacrificing. And then if there's an issue mid-year getting kicked out of the school, they lose the funding for the rest of the year, and that not being something, but again, that's not something that came up in our sample. I think in general, it's really hard to have this conversation like starting in this moment and not taking into the history of education funding in Florida or in this country or the way that we value education. And also the parents themselves brought up a lot of ableism in the system in general, in all of the systems, public and private. And so for the parents of students with disabilities specifically, it's clear from our report that the more privileges you have income-wise, race-wise, career-wise, it's easier to navigate. And so if we are trying to expand these options to parents who are from lower income or more diverse backgrounds, again, there are just really clear ways that these parents identify that if they're struggling with them, other parents too, who like English is maybe not their primary language, will also struggle. And so I think there definitely needs to be more intentional collecting of the experiences of the parents who weren't included in our study, so that we can really confirm this and figure out how to expand sort of the capital and the networks and the benefits. But in general, I just think that it's such a red herring. You know, when I talk to school providers, when I talk to parents, and when I talk to students, regardless of what system they're in, they're all just trying to get the best for the students in front of them. And so again, and as a country, I think we need to have a reckoning about how we value education in general and how we fund it, because we're finding over insufficient funding for everyone to begin with. But again, our study definitely clearly like highlights that it is easier if you have more income. And so that's a problem if you're trying to reduce the gap.
Right, and as you mentioned, yeah, or as I think multiple people mentioned, that Doug, you most recently just mentioned, I mean, that's an issue, you know, across systems, you know, that you know, there's inequities by income regardless. And what are the big ideas about how to start to close those income gaps, you know, inequities around income. We are starting to get close to time. The time has definitely flown by from this really wonderful discussion. Again, just thank you all for participating with us today. One thing that I see some of our audience has brought up, and something that I know is talked about in the report, and I just in talking with all of you, I know you've all thought about this, which is the issue of accountability. And there's a question of, you know, these are public dollars, and therefore, you know, arguably there should be some sort of accountability. You know, somebody could argue that there should be accountability measures for the outcomes being produced from those public dollars, but it becomes difficult when it goes into private schools versus public schools. And with that, there's like sort of a, you know, a piece that aligns with that you brought up, Doug, before, which was your aspiration of IEPs for all students. And, you know, that's something that is, you know, obviously attached to IDEA, you know, the federal regs. And so would love just some thoughts, you know, from all of you about how you see that actually happening in the private sector with school, about how you can create accountability, again, for the benefit of who we're all talking about today, which is the students and their families, to make sure that they are receiving all the supports that they need and deserve.
Well, a couple thoughts. You know, I noticed President Biden did a phenomenal job, I think, in creating a $3,000 tax credit for families. There's no strings attached. You can spend the money any way you want. And I think there's bipartisan support in Washington to put a lot more money into families and giving them support to spend that money any when they want. We're not there. We actually aren't quite that libertarian as the Democrats and Republicans in Washington are. But I do think that you have to find the right balance. If you overregulate these programs, you might as well just meet the old boss same as the new boss. And so I think the key is increase the amount of money that people have, increase the information that they have. I do think there is a role for regulation in terms of safety and health and information sharing. But as I said before, we now have 150 years of experience. You can't regulate your way to excellence. You can't do that. And there's no evidence any place that you do that. You have to maximize your human capital. And I think that's ultimately what's going to work. And that's why I'm a real believer in power redistribution and giving power to people that historically haven't had power. And once they have that power, I think we shouldn't be afraid of that. You know, all the time I have white liberals come to me and say, because I'm part of their tribe, that I am one too, saying, look, I'm not really sure those people are capable of making good decisions. And I know who they mean by those people. But I think at the end of the day, those people do have maximum assets and value that we need to tap into. We just got to build a system that allows us to do that.
Megan, curious if you have any kind of final words about that issue of accountability as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of accountability that's non-existent in the private schools that receive these vouchers, and that's a big concern. And why I was talking about outcomes and the need for a system to hold those schools accountable for actually serving and meeting the needs of students if they're going to take public dollars to do that. I think I just have to say again, like, we keep talking about giving people power, but I think the evidence, even of this report, shows not all people have that power. And so I'm not comfortable promoting a system that gives some people power when the majority who don't have it have to continue to struggle in public schools. And so I just, I think that's an important point to keep raising. This isn't choice. This is perpetuating the status quo and the inequities that have long been in our system. And just because they're beyond education doesn't mean we should accept them in education.
Oh, go ahead, Albert. I saw you.
I mean, well, I don't know. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, look, we're trying to find the next best thing, right? I mean, I can't let the perfect be enemy of the good here. And, I just got to go back to what Doug's observing, right? I mean, look, there's problems everywhere, and I'm for an all hands on deck type solution. I don't necessarily see the concern that Megan's raising here about, just because not everyone's using it, whether that's a bad idea altogether. I mean, look, for the families that use it, look, they've got needs and struggles and challenges, and for them, this program has made their life better. Has it made everybody's life better? Not yet, and so that's something we work to, and whether we, put in, more accountability measures or increase the size of the scholarship to do that. I mean, look, we can have a debate about whether to put in, but about what kind of regs to put in. But again, we just want to tread lightly here because look, we've been trying to do accountability even among public schools, ramping it up for the past 20 years with No Child Left Behind, and certainly that has on one hand maybe highlighted some of the inequities that previously went hidden. But have we really delivered and closed the gaps after all that? I'm not entirely sure that we have. And so, we really have to think through what we mean by accountability, and it might just look different than what we think across the sectors. And so, you look with the ESAs and private schools, accountability looks different there, right? You have accountability with without some of the kind of legal kind of infrastructure, right? You have this, I guess, old-fashioned personal connections, and look, that's not perfect, but I'm all for trying something else and looking at different sectors to do things differently to see if we can learn from each other and find a solution.
Thank you, and thank you all. I can see that we're. Thanks everyone for attending. I know we are hitting up against time, and I think what is clearly apparent is that one, we knew coming in the questions of choice and of supporting young people, especially those most vulnerable and who and the students we're talking about tend to fall into those categories of being vulnerable. And when I mean vulnerable, to be more precise, is to be vulnerable to fall into the cracks of our education system, and to be vulnerable to not achieving or reaching their potential that we know that they have. And so, I appreciate all of you bringing your sort of honest and full sort of selves to the discussion, because these aren't easy discussions, and we're not, we clearly weren't going to resolve all the issues that we know need to be addressed today. But I hope for everybody that at least this discussion sparked some new thinking, sparked some some passion around these issues that we know everybody has. And again, just to push out our own report, we hope that our report is helpful in providing insights into how families are really thinking about the issues that their own children are facing and ways that maybe systems can be refined to better support them. So again, want to thank the Walton Family Foundation for their support of the work. Again, for helping to fund the work that we did that resulted in this report. A huge thank you to our panelists. If we were all live, there'd be huge applause, I would think. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules, and thank everybody here who's been watching for your time. And we will hopefully be in touch soon with you all. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you all.